A very quick introduction. We're very brief on introductions here, but in the spirit of the school, 3 points about Ambassador Dasgupta. First of all, he's from the Indian Foreign Service and has served in many very important posts, but perhaps most importantly, the European Union as ambassador to China as well, and ambassador to the United Nations, and of course a distinguished 3 years almost in Singapore in 1981-83. So you're no stranger to these parts. In respect of today's proceedings, of course, one should note that Mr. Dasgupta was the head of the Indian delegation in the preparatory negotiations for the Rio Summit on Environment and Development, 1992, as well as the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UFCCC. He returned to the global negotiations on climate change during 2002-2010 and is currently a member of the Indian Prime Minister's Council on Climate Change, also a member of the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in Geneva, and a distinguished fellow at the Energy and Resources Institute, TERI, in New Delhi. Third point, he's also a writer, a historian, and is the author of a highly regarded book on Kashmir, War and Diplomacy in Kashmir, 1947-48, which is not part of today's deliberations, but in any case, point you to it, and was awarded the Padma Bhushan by the President of India for his services. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for your very generous introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm greatly honored to address this forum. In the short space of only 7 years, the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy has gained an enviable international reputation as a center of excellence in its chosen field. It is one of those elite institutions that makes Singapore a powerhouse of ideas in the Asian continent. Mr. Chairman, the 21st century has been hailed as the Asian century. Asia has witnessed unparalleled rates of growth, and its share of global trade and investment flows has risen dramatically. Strong economic growth in Asia provides a stimulus to the efforts of the older economic powers, the United States, the European Union, and Japan, to free themselves from recent recessionary trends. In parallel with their economic progress, Asian states are attaining new levels of political and diplomatic influence in world affairs. The global distribution of power is undergoing a radical transformation, reflecting the ascendancy of Asia. These hugely important changes grab media headlines around the world, and many people of our generation see Asia's rise as the defining feature of the 21st century. But we may well ask if future generations will share this assessment. When future historians survey the 21st century from a more distant perspective, will they view the redistribution of global economic and political power as the salient feature of our times? I think their assessment will be rather different. Viewing this century against the backdrop of history, they will perceive the shift in the global power balance as little more than a return to the patterns of the past. Through most of history, great and powerful states in Asia have had few rivals in other continents. Recall the glories of the Mayapahit, Srivijaya and Khmer kingdoms in Southeast Asia, the Maurya, Gupta and Mughal rulers of South Asia, and the Tang and Ming dynasties in China, to name only a few Asian great powers in the past. Viewing Asia's rise against this longer historical perspective, future historians will focus on a different, though related, development. they will celebrate the 21st century as the period in which Asia freed itself from the phenomenon of mass poverty. A few Asian states, including, of course, Singapore, have already achieved this status. And by the latter half of the century, virtually all Asian countries will be able to provide their citizens with the basic requirements of food, shelter, health, and education. There may still be destitute individuals, but mass poverty will cease to exist for the first time in our history. Future historians surveying our times from the distance of a century or two may view the abolition of mass poverty rather than the shift in the global power balance as the defining feature of Asian history in the 21st century. But from either perspective, Asia's economic and political ascent or the associated freedom from mass poverty, Asia is taking a giant step forward. At the same time, as we noted earlier, Asia's rise is also providing a stimulus for growth in other geographical regions. But despite these facts, concerns are being voiced about the impact of rapid economic development on the environment, on the quality of air, soil, and water. And the loudest expressions of concern relate to the implications of Asia's development for climate change, the most urgent global environmental problem of our times. I think these concerns are largely misplaced. Economic development and in particular industrialization does of course generate increased pollution and added stresses on the environment. But at the same time, it also provides the financial and technological resources that are needed to take remedial action to counter pollution and furthermore to improve the quality of the local environment. Indeed, development enables us to protect and enhance the environment. When we look around us, we see that developed countries generally have cleaner water supplies, superior sanitation and waste disposal systems, and better urban air quality than poorer countries. Most industrialized countries have higher environmental standards than low or medium income developing countries. The explanation stares us in the face. Developed countries possess the resources needed to tackle pollution effectively. Poorer countries lack adequate resources to protect and enhance the environment. Some environmental activists take a narrow view of conservation. They regard environmental protection as conservation, as preserving things in the state in which they currently are. And they tend to oppose any major human interference with quote-unquote nature. This romantic view presupposes the existence of some past golden age when nature was quote-unquote unspoiled, existing in all its pristine glory. The reality, of course, is that the planet was never a perfect Garden of Eden. Our environment has been in a state of continuous evolution ever since the planet came into existence, mainly due to the operation of natural forces. Natural forces were responsible for the cyclical onset and retreat of an ice age, bringing in its wake sweeping changes in the Earth's environment. Human activities have till now played only a secondary and relatively modest role in shaping our environment. Every step in the advance of civilization has had an impact on the environment. The invention of fire led to the rotational clearing of forests associated with shifting cultivation. The invention of iron enabled human beings to permanently clear large tracts of forests for farming or livestock breeding. Irrigation works hugely modified the environment. Expansion of trade led to migration of many varieties of edible plants and other species. The environmental impact of the Industrial Revolution in its early stages is lamented in the 19th century literary classics of all major European languages. Not all the changes wrought by man have been beneficial for the environment, but on balance, the changes have undoubtedly been for the better. Men and women live longer and healthier lives today than in any previous age. Human existence is no longer nasty, brutish, and short, to quote Hobbes's description of an earlier natural age. The environment today is more conducive to human life and well-being than in any imaginary unspoiled age in the past. Historically speaking, therefore, there can be no question that on the whole, economic development has benefited the environment. At the UN Conference on Environment, which was held in Stockholm in 1972, the Indian Prime Minister, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, demystified the links between development and environment. She forcefully pointed out that environment cannot be improved in conditions of poverty. And she went on to say, and I quote, "The environmental problems of developing countries are not the side effects of excessive industrialization, but reflect the inadequacy of development. The rich countries may look upon development as the cause of environmental destruction, but to us, it is one of the primary means of improving the environment for living, for providing food, water, sanitation, and shelter, of making deserts green and mountains habitable," unquote. Indira Gandhi was deeply conscious of the need to protect India's environmental heritage, and this was reflected, for example, in her historic contributions to protecting our primeval forests and endangered species. She was also acutely conscious of the fact that only economic growth could generate the resources required to protect and enhance the environment. She understood clearly that development and environment protection are not conflicting goals, but interdependent objectives. There is an interdependent relationship between development and environment. If we squander our environmental heritage, we will certainly imperil the prospects of long-term development. But at the same time, if we fail to achieve rapid development, we will fail to protect the environment for lack of adequate resources. In planning major development projects, therefore, we must conduct environmental impact assessments and take the environmental costs into account. An appropriate part of the profits generated by the project must be employed to remedy or offset any environmental damage. It will not always be possible to fully reverse the changes wrought to the local environment. In such cases, compensatory or offset measures should be taken to enhance the local environmental quality in other directions. The objective must be to ensure that there is no overall depletion of environmental capital. Let me now sum up this first part of my argument. The view of some environmental activists that massive development projects generate pollution, destroy nature, and are therefore inimical to the environment is an entirely romantic and false view. They lack a rational basis. The view that environment can be reconciled with protection of the environment is not incorrect, but it fails to fully capture the interrelationship between development and the environment. It falls short of recognizing that development is a necessary condition for protecting and enhancing the environment. Development yields the resources needed to improve the quality of the environment. In combination with sensible environment impact assessments and accounting of environmental assets, development enables us to protect and improve our environment. Asia's economic rise will therefore open the door to enhancing the quality of our local or domestic environment. I now turn from local to global environmental issues. A global environmental problem is one in which human activities in a particular country have an environmental impact that is not confined to the borders of the country or even its neighborhood, but extends to the planet as a whole. Indeed, in such cases, the main victims of pollution may have little or no responsibility for causing the problem in the first place. Therefore, global environmental issues raise complex problems of international burden sharing and international cooperation. Climate change is undoubtedly the most pressing global environmental problems of our times. Our planet has experienced several cyclical climate changes over the ages because of the operation of forces of nature, as we have seen already. But the current phenomenon of global warming is unprecedented. Its unique feature is that it is not caused by nature, but by human activities. Its primary cause is the ever-increasing consumption of hydrocarbon fuels, coal, petroleum, and natural gas, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Combustion of increasing quantities of hydrocarbon fuels has generated a corresponding increase in emissions of carbon dioxide, the main greenhouse gas, into the atmosphere. And since carbon dioxide has a life of well over a century, these emissions have led to a progressive buildup or concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, causing the phenomenon of climate change, or in popular parlance, global warming. Unlike the cyclical changes of past ages, the phenomenon that we are confronting today has been caused by human beings. And since it is directly related to the use of hydrocarbon fuels, what we are talking about when we speak of international agreements to combat climate change are agreements that will regulate the levels and patterns of the use of hydrocarbon fuels, of coal and oil and natural gas. And therefore, they are absolutely crucial there's a crucial relationship with economic development. Now, the increased carbon dioxide emissions in the atmosphere have originated mainly in the developed countries ever since the Industrial Revolution began. They are associated not only with high levels of past and present industrial and mechanized agricultural production, but also with affluent lifestyles involving heavy fuel consumption for private transportation, heating, and other domestic uses. For this reason, per capita emissions in North America, Europe, and Japan are far higher than in typical developing countries. And the disparity becomes even starker when past emissions are taken into account. And it is very important to remember past emissions. As I said, carbon dioxide is a life of well over a century. So in the case of Singapore, which is a highly developed country, but not a developed country for purposes of the climate change negotiation, you have fairly high current emission levels. But if you take into account historical or past emissions, Singapore's per capita emissions are still relatively low compared to that of the earlier industrialized countries of Europe or North America. Now, if all countries had the same low per capita emissions as a developing countries such as India, the climate change problem would not have arisen. The problem has arisen because of excessively high levels of past and present per capita emissions in the north. And for this reason, the UN Convention on Climate Change, which was adopted in 1992, draws a clear distinction between the respective commitments of developed and developing countries, recognizing the responsibility of the developed countries for causing climate change, as well as their greater financial and technological capabilities for responding to the problem. It explicitly notes that, and I quote, "The largest share of historical and current emissions of greenhouse gases has originated in the developed countries, that per capita emissions in developing countries are still relatively low, and that the share of global emissions originating in developing countries will grow to meet their social and development needs," unquote. The convention therefore requires developed countries to first stabilize and then reduce their emissions in a time-bound manner. Developed countries are also required to provide, and I quote, "such financial resources, including for the transfer of technology, needed by the developing country parties to meet the agreed full incremental costs of implementing measures," unquote. Now, what about developing countries? Developing countries have a general commitment that is common to all countries, to implement measures to mitigate and adapt to climate change. But in the case of developing countries, this general commitment is conditional upon receipt of financial and technological support from developed countries. And the convention states this explicitly. I quote, "The extent to which developing country parties will effectively implement their commitments under the convention will depend on the effective implementation by developed country parties of their commitments under the convention related to financial resources and transfer of technology, and will take fully into account that economic and social development and poverty eradication are the first and overriding, I emphasize overriding, priorities of the developing country parties," unquote. The convention left some unfinished business. It fell short of specifying specific time-bound emission reduction targets for each developed country. And this lacuna was filled by another agreement called the Kyoto Protocol, which was agreed in December 1997. The Kyoto Protocol assigned a quantified emission reduction target to each developed country with the overall aim of reducing aggregate emissions originating in these countries by 5.2% compared to 1990 levels by the years 2008 to 2012, by that period. Unfortunately, however, the implementation of the protocol has been spotty, and many developed countries are unlikely to meet their targets by next year, 2012, which is going to be the end of the first commitment period. The United States, after having pressed for adoption of the protocol in Kyoto, without the United States there would have been no Kyoto Protocol, but having achieved the success, it soon thereafter decided to pull out of the agreement. Japan and Russia have now made it clear that they will not agree to emission reduction targets for a second commitment period under the Kyoto Protocol. Australia and Canada are also unprepared to accept such commitments unless the protocol itself is radically revised. Even the European Union is lukewarm at best about future commitments under the protocol. Moreover, developed countries are now insisting that developing countries should also take on binding emission commitments in some quantifiable form, even though this is not consistent with the UN Convention or the Kyoto Protocol. In other words, the developed countries are now pressing to radically revise the basis of the existing climate treaties, and with a view to shifting a major part of their responsibilities under the convention to the shoulders of developing countries. Now, partly in order to accommodate these demands, but mainly I think as a reflection of their sense of responsibility as global citizens, most developing countries have announced voluntary targets to moderate their emissions. I repeat, voluntary targets, not international legally binding targets, but voluntary national targets to moderate their emissions. For example, India and China have set themselves very impressive emission intensity reduction targets. That is to say, to reduce emissions per unit of GDP. Singapore's target is a substantial reduction from business as usual emissions. Now, these voluntary initiatives on the part of developing countries have so far failed to elicit an adequate response from developed countries. In many cases, even the limited commitments announced by developed countries are subject to conditions and loopholes that make them problematical, to say the least. For example, one developed country has made its commitment conditional on the passage of domestic legislation, a condition which admittedly cannot be met in the near future, and this is widely recognized by all in that country itself. Another developed country has made its commitment conditional on the passage of legislation in a neighboring country, not in its own country, but if the neighbor does it, then they will achieve such and such. And in full knowledge of the fact that the neighboring country will not be able to pass such legislation in the near future. But even if we disregard all these conditions and assume that all the commitments pledged by developed countries are implemented in full, the scale of aggregate emission reductions would fall far short of the minimum 25% reduction for 2020, which these countries themselves have endorsed. And therefore, as you can see, the agreement, the commitments they have announced are largely meaningless, but in any case fall far short of the targets which they themselves have set for themselves. Why have developed countries become so reluctant to honor their moral and treaty obligations in letter and in spirit? In the first place, experience has shown that emission reductions involve substantial costs, notwithstanding the optimistic predictions of some academic economists. Developed countries blessed with abundant petroleum and coal deposits have been particularly reluctant to adopt or to implement carbon emission reduction commitments, since such commitments would involve reduced dependence on these fuels. In contrast to these countries, the European Union, which is a net importer of oil and gas, has adopted relatively significant, though still inadequate, emission reduction commitments. A second factor is the recessionary trends that have appeared in most developed countries, including the United States, the European Union, and Japan. This is not a conducive economic climate for ambitious mitigation measures. The attention of these countries is focused on economic recovery rather than emission reductions. Last but not least, the rise of the so-called emerging economies has triggered off competitiveness concerns in the developed countries. Influential industrialists and trade unionists in the developed world are arguing that emission reduction policies raise their costs relative to those of developing countries like China, India, Brazil, and so on. They fear losing domestic and export markets as well as jobs, which is why trade unions are also involved in pushing for protectionism. Not only are these countries, these powerful political centers reluctant to take on new emission reduction commitments, but they are also pressing their governments to levy countervailing border taxes in some form on imports from developing countries. Protectionism is raising its ugly head in the developed countries. And in the context of climate change, the implications are huge for the future of the liberal trading regime that we have. Because climate change involves every sector of production. And if you start levying, entering this game of sort of levying border taxes, it will cover, a very wide cross-section of goods that are traded. And it will effectively undo the liberal trading regime that we have. Now, the reluctance of the developed countries to fulfill their international obligations under the UN Convention and the Kyoto Protocol, in letter and in spirit, possesses a major dilemma for the developing countries. Though developed countries are mainly responsible for causing climate change, the impacts of climate change will fall most heavily on developing countries. Low-lying deltas, such as the Ganges, Brahmaputra, and the Mekong basins, together with small islands, will be the most severely affected by sea level rise. In view of the refusal of developed countries to bear their proper share of the burden of mitigation, should developing countries make an heroic effort to shoulder an unjust burden by moderating their greenhouse gas emissions, even at the cost of restricting their energy options and slowing down their development. This is the question that they have to confront. Or should they instead focus on adaptation to climate change by building up their capacity to cope with its impacts? For a developing country, what is the most effective response to the threat of climate change? Now, developing countries are extremely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change because of their flimsy infrastructure and their inability to adopt new techniques and technologies. Dwellings, particularly in rural areas, are often so flimsy that they are unable to withstand even seasonal changes, such as heavy monsoon rains or strong winds, leave alone the expected impacts of climate change. Roads, bridges, culverts, flood control and water storage infrastructure need to be greatly upgraded and expanded in order to give a developing country even a modest capacity to cope with the extreme weather events and changes in rainfall patterns associated with climate change. Traditional farmers in developing countries are highly vulnerable to variations in temperatures and rainfall patterns. They lack the financial resources and often also the skills required to adapt to climate change by switching over to such measures as drought-resistant plant varieties, drip irrigation, large-scale water conservation measures, etc. The point is that adaptation to climate change will require a wide range of responses, including massive construction of new physical infrastructure, watershed management, coastline protection, improved disaster management capacities, etc. Poorer countries will be unable to implement these measures on a significant scale unless they are able to generate the required resources through rapid development. In the final analysis, therefore, an effective climate change strategy for a developing country must be based on rapid development. As the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change itself states, and I quote, "Economic and social development and poverty eradication are the first and overriding priorities of the developing country parties," unquote. For poorer countries, slowing down development in order to contain emissions is a prescription for disaster. It would leave future generations in these countries without any significant capacity to cope with or adapt to the impacts of climate change. This does not mean that developing countries do not need to implement appropriate mitigation measures. There is a range of win-win options, mitigation measures, that involve no significant additional costs and therefore do not result in diversion of scarce resources from development priorities. These measures can promote development while yielding co-benefits in terms of mitigating climate change. The most important of these win-win measures are cost-effective energy efficiency and energy saving programs. These simultaneously promote our development and mitigation goals. Wasteful energy consumption retards and unnecessarily increases emission levels. For this reason, it is not surprising that countries like India and China have adopted national energy intensity reduction goals as the centerpiece of their mitigation actions. Secondly, developing countries can explore possible synergies between their health-related social development goals and climate change mitigation. For example, the switchover from diesel to compressed natural gas, CNG, in Delhi's public transportation system was primarily aimed at reducing ambient air pollution and promoting public health, but it also has the effect of reducing carbon emissions. While advancing a development goal, it also promotes climate change mitigation as a co-benefit. Finally, in pursuing energy security as a developmental goal, oil importing developing countries should explore cost-effective options for switching to renewable energy sources such as hydroelectric, solar, and wind power. We are likely to witness a gradual transition from hydrocarbons to renewable energy during the next several decades. We should position ourselves advantageously to derive the maximum advantage from this transition in order to promote our development and mitigation goals. In short, without compromising their development priorities, developing countries can and should seek out possible opportunities for obtaining co-benefits in the area of climate change mitigation. But as we saw earlier, it would be folly for them to slow down development by constraining their energy options, since this would leave them without any capacity to adapt to climate change. Mr. Chairman, allow me to sum up my argument. Economic and social development is a prerequisite for effectively protecting and enhancing the quality of our local environment. Only through rapid development can we acquire the resources needed to repair environmental damage and enhance the quality of our environment. Global, as distinct from local environmental problems, raise more complex issues. If the countries primarily responsible for causing the problem are unwilling to accept their responsibility for preventing damage or compensating the victims. Climate change is an example of such a problem. Developed countries are primarily responsible for causing climate change, but they are refusing to shoulder the full burden of an adequate response, posing a dilemma for poorer countries. Developing countries should lose no opportunity to implement development options that yield mitigation co-benefits, but it would be a flawed strategy on their part to slow down development or constrain their energy options in the interests of mitigation. Such a strategy would deprive future generations in poorer countries of any significant capacity to cope with climate change. Thank you for your patience, particularly on a day when you have an India versus Pakistan cricket match.
For those of you who follow, for those of you who care about cricket anyway. Thank you very much, Mr. Dasgupta. This morning, Surya Sethi spoke on India's energy and climate change policies and came to quite a pessimistic, indeed gloomy conclusion. I think we've had from Ambassador Dasgupta a far more optimistic view of what might be done. Let me throw open the floor to questions, quarrels, endorsements, beginning there.
I'm not sure if it's a quarrel, but I want to ask you about what I would call the environmental shell game. I think you know the game where you have 3 shells and you put a marble under it and you move it around. You mentioned that developing nations or developed nations have been able to use their economies to address environmental issues to some extent. And I think, though, to a fair amount, these nations have been able to, and individuals have been able to use their economies to move the environmental problem elsewhere. Climate change is maybe an example of that. And as the world develops, the opportunity to move those polluting generations and other things to other countries and other areas decreases. And I'm wondering if you see this shell game as something that will be a problem with climate change and with pollution, and is there something, are there tools that can be done to deal with it, regulatory or incentive type tools?
Okay, there are two parts in it, the statement that you made. The first was a more general sort of part, and that was the question of, as it were, exporting an environmental problem to another country. And the second part of your question, if I understood it correctly, referred to this in the specific context of climate change. Now, let me deal with the two separately. The first part, I think you are quite right. This is absolutely right. For example, in the case of many hazardous wastes, these have been shipped to developing countries which do not have proper regulatory measures or even the means to detect or to understand what is being shipped into their borders. And this has caused huge environmental problems. And in a way, the problems that we are seeing off the Somali coast are of this nature, because we've had sort of huge amounts of dangerous waste matter dumped into the seas of the Somali coastline, resulting in a depletion of its natural fish resources, etc. And this is one of the factors. It's not a justification in any way, but this is one of the factors which explain why the local fishing communities have, in some cases, moved over to piracy. So what you say is quite true in the context of local environmental problems. Can this happen in the context of climate change? Here, the issue is more complex. The argument of those who say, yes, it can, is that large carbon-emitting plants might be transferred from a well-regulated state in the north to a less well-regulated state in the south. In theory, this is possible. In practice, it's very difficult to find instances where this has happened. And I have not come across many empirical studies which establish that such a movement has taken place. And the reasons for this are that there are many other factors which determine movement of capital, and particularly of physical plant, from one part of the world to another part of the world. And environmental standards is only one of them. The existence of infrastructure in that country, does it have roads, does it have harbors, does it have ports, does it have an adequate market potential, a domestic potential, what sort of tax regime does it have? These are hugely more important than just the regulatory fact. And for this reason, though I think in theory, this sort of thing could happen, in point of fact, we haven't seen it happening on any significant scale, or at least we do not have any empirical evidence of its happening. So in the context of climate change, I would discount the argument. But it is true, in other contexts, in other environmental contexts, yes, it is a problem.
Yes, and then I'll come back to you. Yep.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm just throwing a wild card, okay? Sure. I hope you don't mind on this. How much is because the disparity between the developed countries and the developing countries, in terms of consumption, right, of energy,
yes,
is very great. How much of it is due to lifestyle and archaic infrastructure that needs to be upgraded to be more efficient versus the developing countries? Because the developing countries, they have acquired new technology, so to speak, because they start from a low base.
Yeah.
Right? Whatever they acquire tends to be the latest. Whereas those in the developed countries have established infrastructures, right? And for them to renew those infrastructure might be very, very costly. And therefore, they are reluctant to do it. And these infrastructure are being less efficient. Your views, please.
Yes. Let me sort of make sure that I've understood your sort of question. What you're saying is that that there were two parts of the question. Firstly, the relationship between carbon emissions and the level of development, as it were, that's the first thing. Or are there other factors also which affect it? And the second part of your question was, again, please correct me if I'm wrong, that since developing countries are making a quantum jump, going into new sort of plants, and whereas plants in a developed countries still have some years of life, let's say 10 years, 15 years, shouldn't the transition first occur here in a developing country? Okay.
My question is not, shouldn't they, could this be the reason for them to be reluctant?
To be reluctant to do that. Right. Okay. So the first part, I think there is a broad correlation, but not an exact correlation, between per capita emissions and the roughly speaking, the per capita income of a country. It's not an exact correlation because take a country like Brazil, or Bhutan for that matter, which relies largely on hydroelectric power. Emissions are low because, but for normal countries, that is to say countries reliant on coal and oil, there is a fairly high degree of correlation between per capita, sort of energy consumption and emissions. Having said this, we must also note that lifestyle differences are a modifying factor. If you take North America, Canada, and the United States, and compare it to, say, Japan or the EU, there is a substantial difference in per capita emissions. Why? Because lifestyles differ. Now, this term lifestyle, what does it mean? And the Americans, I'm afraid, have a very incorrect sort of comprehension here, because they're absolutely determined not to enter into any debate involving a lifestyle changes. And President Bush, whom I admire for other reasons, on this he said any changes in American lifestyle, cannot be discussed. I don't think there's such a thing as an American lifestyle. What are we talking about lifestyle changes? What it means is things like, let us say, the extent to which you rely on public transportation rather than private transportation. That is the biggest change in lifestyle. Now, if you look at it this way, lifestyles in New York or Boston are very different from lifestyles in, say, Los Angeles. New York, Boston have decent public transportation systems. Los Angeles has a rotten public transportation systems. That is the sort of changes in lifestyle which make for different in emissions. Urban planning. If you have no neighborhood shops, a shop where you can pick up a newspaper, a loaf of bread, a bottle of milk, if you have to travel 10 miles in order to get to the nearest place where you can make your daily purchases, then you have a lifestyle which is not conducive to climate change mitigation. So these are the changes, and I don't think there's such a thing as an American lifestyle. One part of America compared to another part of America can have very different lifestyles. California, for example, has the most enlightened environmental regulations, yet its per capita emissions are high, partly because of a rather poorly developed public transportation system, for various historical reasons in most parts of California. Okay, so that's the first part of the question. But there is a broad correlation between energy consumption. Obviously, India has a per capita emissions of under 1.5 tons of carbon equivalent per annum. The United States is somewhere near a little over 19. This is partly because of the fact that in India, a substantial percentage of the population still does not have a power connection. So you can't expect a country in our position to constrain its energy options, in the interest of climate change mitigation. Now I turn to the next part of your sort of question, whether the technological leap should not, in fact, first happen in developing countries rather than in developed countries. In a few cases, this may happen, But I think, by and large, this is not the pattern that you're going to see. Why? Because when you have a change in technology, it's not something which happens sort of overnight, it doesn't come in full. You have a new product, its per unit price tends to be fairly high in the initial stages. And then it tends to fall, fairly sort of sharply in many cases. And therefore, affordability is an extremely important factor. And certainly affordability, in developed countries, you're first going to see the change because it's more affordable. Relatively small number of units will be consumed in the initial stages. And then as the technology becomes mature, the per unit costs fall, the market expands, costs fall further as production expands, and then it goes into developing countries. So if you take almost any sort of thing, for example, the iPad, this is the sort of pattern that you're going to see. And I think this will also, be the case with climate change sort of mitigation events. It's not going to happen first in developing countries. Now, having said that, still when it has become mature, it's the percentage of units in a developing country as a proportion of its total may still be a little higher than in a developed country because they still have these older units. And therefore, you may have newer and more efficient units here. This again has been fairly typical in, in the process of industrial evolution. But by and large, you're going to see the products coming into use in developed countries. Most of the products will be invented, will be produced first in a developed country rather than in a developing country. The prices will be affordable in a developed country, not a developing country. It's only when the technology becomes mature after a few years that you're going to see a wide market in developing countries.
So, do you have any update on the so-called Copenhagen spirit between India and China, which made President Obama run in circles for a while? And secondly, Singapore makes a distinction between, consumption by its citizens and the consequential impact on the environment, and the emissions traceable to production in Singapore for the outside world.
I'm sorry, I didn't follow the latter.
Singapore says that its overall emissions are high because it has got petrochemical complexes which produce for the rest of the world. Those emissions cannot be traced to the per capita consumption of Singapore citizens. They make a distinction.
Yes, I see what you mean. Okay, so can I take the second question first? This is something which applies to Singapore. Look, Singapore does not have, when you consider Singapore's per capita incomes, its emissions are not terribly high. Its fuel-related consumption, now I'm relying on memory, the 2008 figure, I think, was something like 9.6 tons of carbon per person, which is a little below the European average and something like half the US average. You're absolutely right. The petrochemical production increases Singapore's sort of thing. On the other hand, Singapore is has a terribly important service sector, and here I think that tends to bring your per capita emissions down a bit. It's a post-industrial society in that sense. So much for Singapore's emission. Now, this point that you are making, that look, we are exporting these goods, this is a point which also has been made by other countries such as China in particular, because what they say is that a large part of their industrial production is sort of goes abroad. And in the case of China, it's much more complicated than in the case of Singapore, because here you are importing crude, you are making petrochemical products, and you're exporting it. So you know exactly what you're exporting. In the case of China, they're importing a lot of, not raw materials, but partial manufactures, which are then assembled. There's value addition in China, and then it is re-exported. So exactly what part of the value addition, how it's a complicated story. But again, much more than Singapore or China, it's the oil exporting countries that have advanced this case. Saying that, all right, we have oil refineries here because we produce oil, we live on oil, and we aren't consuming all this oil, the rest of the world is. So why blame us for it? So I think that, yeah, these are factors which have to be taken into account, and you have to make some allowance for it in, in coming to any international agreement.
The Copenhagen spirit.
Oh, the Copenhagen spirit. The funny thing, I was at Copenhagen. The funny thing is how countries switch their assessment. Many countries, not all, switch their assessment of what actually happened in Copenhagen. I can tell you, for example, that most EU leaders there were quite dejected, at Copenhagen itself, because they thought that the ball had passed to other players, primarily to India and the basic countries, the basic group. But within a couple of weeks, we saw them as the champions and defenders of the Kyoto Protocol. If you don't believe me, please see the press interviews immediately on Copenhagen in the European newspapers, their leaders, and what they were saying 2 weeks later. All right? To some extent, you had that confused reaction even on the part of the United States, because today what you're hearing is showed cooperation between China, countries like the BRICS group, China, India, Brazil, and the United States, and that is not at its quite true. So this was sort of welcome. But again, there was some you would read stories in the US newspapers about how they felt that the Chinese delegation had been very rude to them and so on and so forth, and which I think was not true. So I think the basic picture is, yes, you did see cooperation at Copenhagen between the United States and the basic countries. I do not say that there was exact accord between all of them. There are still differences, important differences. But we did see both parties, making mutual sort of concessions in order to come to, some form of agreement. Some understanding would be a better word. Yeah.
One of the most cautious diplomatic statements I've heard in a long time, but there and then there.
The speaker in the morning mentioned that for India to sort of successfully, ensure that development happens along with, the conservation of energy, we need to actively pursue a redistribution of the way energy is currently allocated to the various sectors in India. In terms of, the rural areas which have very little right now and as a result are not seeing development need to be given a bigger share of the energy pie. But obviously India is not ramping up its capacity fast enough to ensure distribution and growth of the cities. So do you think if we go down the track of redistribution without ramping up fast enough, it will hurt the country more than it actually will help it? Because the centers of production obviously are in the big cities, the GDP obviously generated there, more people are moving there. But the claim is that 600 million people are without electricity, sanitation, etc. Shouldn't the energy resources go there? Do you think it's possible to strike a balance, or pursue only one?
I think the answer is threefold. One, we have to rapidly expand generation of power.
That doesn't seem to be an option,
which we are doing. The targets are fairly sort of. Number two, there has to be a balance struck, what you were saying. Number three, there will still be people who are off the grid. And the easiest and currently the economic way of reaching power to them, not in adequate quantities, but to meet essential needs, in many cases will be renewable energy, solar and wind. In many island territories, in remote hills, solar energy or hydropower will be, extremely effective. In some areas, wind, but that's more selective because, you don't get it sort of all over the country. And therefore, there's a huge scope for solar power. Out of the, in our National Action Program on Climate Change, there are 8 missions, as you know, and one is devoted to solar energy. And it's very important because this is the one way in which, before you extend the grid to cover the whole country, you can immediately provide for some basic, sort of source of power to these countries for such purposes as cooking, for domestic lighting, and very importantly, telecommunications.
Okay. Yes, the second one.
Yes, Mr. Chandrashekhar, you have answered the question partly in regard to the response to the last questioner about the use of more environmentally friendly natural resources such as solar power. Would you like to elaborate further on it? Because solar power and wind power and water power may not be readily available in all parts of the world. So how do you manage that problem?
You are absolutely right. And let's start with hydropower, for example. Yes, it's not available in all parts of the world. Again, there are certain problems associated with large hydro. For example, proneness to earthquakes and, things of that sort. These problems are likely to be exacerbated by the facts of climate change because your river flows are going to change. Therefore, we will have to take these into account in setting engineering standards in future. Solar power, again, is not available in equal measure in all parts of the world. That is true. Here, the big question is storage. How do you store power? What sort of batteries can you create for that? How do you get solar power onto the grid rather than to run a local problem? There are huge technological questions which have to be answered here, on which a lot of work is being done in many countries, and India is one of them, but only one of them. But we are fairly hopeful that the unit costs of solar power will come down pretty sharply over the next 20 years. And the experience of the last few years points in this direction. Now, whether the curve is going to continue falling, who knows? But we are reasonably optimistic about it.
Yeah. Any breakthroughs in scientific research with regard to storage of this?
Well, there are, it's being approached in many sort of different directions. And we can only, we'll have to wait and see, how. One is on batteries. The other is, can you use some form of silicon is rather expensive, which is currently used for storage. So there's an attempt in the United States to build certain sort of power, certain paints, which will substitute for silicon and which are much cheaper. Now, if this works out, the initial studies have been quite encouraging, but we'll have to see whether it can be commercialized. In some European countries, in Italy and Spain, they're experimenting with yet another sort of thing. You concentrate solar and then using various sort of chemicals, you use that to store the heat. We'll have to see which works out. There are a number of approaches which are going on. And
I mean, not to pit you against Surya Sethi this morning, but at lunch when we pushed him on it, he was very, very pessimistic about the fall in per unit cost of solar energy, saying that the limits had probably already been reached, and after 40 years, been very little progress on it, which is a bit scary because it seemed like that might be the cleanest, most enduring technology for the future. But
I must sort of say that Surya is an expert in this area, and I am not. The only thing is that while this is Surya's advice as an expert, We again have other experts who give us a very sort of different picture. And therefore, I personally, I'm not in a position to hazard a guess as to which is the more, is the better informed technological viewpoint. But experts differ in that.
Yep.
Thank you. Ambassador Dasgupta, I would like to ask you on your views on the efficacy and, in fact, the fairness, I would say, of two very commonly used terms in climate change, which you have used too. One is the distinction between the developed and developing countries. Some countries, of course, have objected to that distinction, and you yourself have brought up Brits and so on. And we know that Singapore has consistently been described as a developed country, although we have a high GDP. So is it still, and of course that is one of the problems, has been pointed out as a problem with the Kyoto Protocol. So do you still think that it is the best functional division for future climate change negotiations? Or can you suggest some modifications? And the second term that I'd like to ask you to address is that of carbon intensity. Because there again, you mentioned in relation to China, India, and in fact Singapore, which uses that. Obviously, the countries that are more hopeful about the growing GDP like carbon intensity, but as has been shown, a reduction in carbon intensity may actually be equivalent to an overall increase
Yes.
in carbon emissions.
Yes.
So, in effect, it is not going to go, well, it will go some way, but it's not actually going to reduce our overall carbon emissions. So, of course, some countries prefer carbon intensity to per capita carbon emissions. Perhaps you could address how you see the fairness and also the effective use of one versus the other.
Firstly, the division between developed and developing countries. What happened was in 1992, when the Framework Convention was negotiated, the UN categories for developed and developing countries were used. Developed countries were put into one category. They were called Annex 1. Developing countries were non-Annex 1 countries. Okay. Now, 20 years down the sort of road, what do we see? What we are seeing is that there is a small number of countries, and Singapore is one of them, but also South Korea, Mexico, which are, well, OECD countries with, which are high-income countries. Let's put it like that. They are not low or middle-income countries. And therefore, they are in a sort of a category apart in terms of sort of income levels. But as I said, if you look at it in terms of per capita emissions, current and historical, Singapore still doesn't fall into the same category as the United States or Europe or Japan, because your historical emissions are rather low. And therefore, there's no great sort of injustice done in treating Singapore as a non-Annex 1 country. There you are. The problem with sort of categorization of countries is that you have to have categorization for any agreement. And there is no categorization possible which does not involve some sort of doubtful cases which are on the margin. You can't have any form of classification which avoids that, okay? So what is the option? The option which is being advanced today is gross emissions. What are your total emissions? In which case, a country like India, whose total emissions are large because its population is large, where per capita energy consumption is painfully low, where in fact a substantial percentage of the population does not have a power connection, is still treated as a large emitter in the same group as the United States or Canada, which is absurd. It's like saying, if you have a global food problem and how to approach it, to say that all Indians must be put on a diet, even though their per capita consumption of calories is lower than the medically recommended minimum, because their gross consumption of foodstuffs is so large. You see, so this is an absolutely absurd and ridiculous alternative which is being advanced. And in contrast to this, in comparison to this, I think the established categorization is far superior. Regarding the second point that you mentioned, incidentally, Singapore's target, as far as I'm aware, is not an energy intensity target, it's a reduction from business as usual emissions, which is slightly different. Okay?
Still amounts to an actual increase.
What they're saying is that had we done nothing further about it, our emissions in 2020 would be so much. But we are going to put policies in place which are going to bring it down, if I recall correctly, by 19%. 17%, okay, right, 17%. So that's the sort of target. What ours is that the amount of energy we will use to generate a rupee worth of GDP is going to come down by 25%, which means we'll be using energy more efficiently in short. It doesn't say that our emissions will not go up, they will.
Well, I'm sorry, I've got to cut it off. There's a class that will be held here, and the organizers have told us that we must leave. So let me just thank Ambassador Dasgupta for a wonderful tour of the horizon and for fielding questions. Thank you all very much.